Phone check. 1, 2. The microphone check. 1, 2, 1, 2. The microphone check. I got my headphones tuned between two different AM stations, and my briefcase is full of declassified information. Declassified. Declassified.
Good evening and welcome to News from Neptune for the 21st week of 2015. For almost 25 years, this program has been a spontaneous and unrehearsed discussion of the news of the week and its coverage by the media, first on a so-called community radio station, and when censored and locked out of there, welcomed, I'm happy to say, by the good folks at Urbana Public Television. I'm Carl Estabrook. My discussants tonight are Ron Szoke and David Green. David Green is another year older and deeper in debt, as the poet says, and so a belated happy birthday.
Thank you. I've joined the elderly status now, so we're all equal now.
Welcome to the club.
Yes.
Right. Our program is produced and directed by Jason Liggett, who sees this as a very peculiar reflection. Our program's name, News from Neptune, was chosen to honor Noam Chomsky, who's been talking sense about American politics for twice the quarter century we've been on the air, and is even older. Chomsky has said that in the American media, either you repeat the same conventional doctrines everybody is saying, or else you say something true and will sound like it's from Neptune. And Chomsky is a model for us in all sorts of ways. At the age of 86, he's just married for the second time. So,
well, I've got a beat on that one.
Do you? Well, you're not 86. Oh, I see. I'm sorry. This and previous editions of our program are archived on YouTube and posted to the Facebook page for News from Neptune, where you'll also find comments from viewers, articles we've referred to, and further comments from us. I can be reached at carl@newsfromneptune.com, and I'm happy to receive your comments. Today is the 22nd of May. On this day in 1945, Winston Churchill resigned as Prime Minister of England and brought an end to the wartime government that had existed in Britain throughout the Second World War. We don't, I think, often think about what the developments in Britain say about the war and the years to follow, that in contrast with our notion about American policy in those years. What happened was that the British government had put off elections throughout the war, and immediately the war ended, the British people threw out the party, the coalition, that had run the war, rejected it out of hand, as it would have done probably during the war if elections had been held. Now, in this country, we have the notion that the Second World War was a splendid crusade conducted by Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill that stopped the Nazis from killing the Jews. And this is mainly post-war American mythology. We've recently had occasion to reflect on the fact that the Second World War in Europe was won on the Eastern Front, that is between Russia and Germany, not on the Western Front. That even after the invasion of Normandy, the American and British contribution to the end of the war was a sideshow. Sideshow even in terms of the numbers of troops involved on the Axis side. The dismay of the British electorate with the wartime government was expressed immediately after the war when Churchill was forced out and a labor government came in that laid the bases of modern social democracy in Britain, notably the National Health Service and the other social supports that the British thought they had in fact been deprived of by the war. And in fact, that was quite true. Churchill was not the hero celebrated by the British that the Americans have subsequently claimed he was. On this day, also 20 years later, in 1965, one of the first major university college-based protests against the Vietnam War continued at the University of California at Berkeley. The protest had been going on for some time, as had, of course, the war. Over 5,000 people were involved in a campus protest that set the stage or gave a model for others to follow. Now, there's an awful lot of mythology about those years as well, mythology that, interestingly, the government and media in this country seem to want to rerun right now for fear that a similar movement against the ongoing wars that the U.S. government is conducting will develop as it did in the 1960s. So it's worthwhile to remember the contradictions in what we remember about the politics of war from 1945 and 1965 and what the facts actually were. A half century after the Berkeley demonstrations, we can't draw the lessons from those days because of conscious attempts by government and media right now to misrepresent them. So, you are watching News from Neptune, a Mythology of War edition, and we'll begin with some real mythology, I think, about contemporary wars, and with David Green.
Yeah, I guess one way of segueing into this would be to going back to your comments about Britain after the wars, that they found themselves with a crumbling empire, and an aspect of that crumbling empire was, of course, the last years of their mandatory governance of Palestine. The British people didn't like it a whole lot, and they weren't really ready to cope with it when their people and their attachés and so forth started getting blown up by individuals who eventually ended up being prime ministers of the state of Israel, namely Menachem Begin and Yitzhak Shamir, the two primary leaders of the terrorist groups that wreaked havoc between 1945 and 1948 before they were reined in, or during which they were reined in by the also not very nice person who ended up being the prime minister of Israel and its kind of founding father. But in any event, let's go to the current fracas regarding the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement and the response of the Illinois legislature. Let's go by the issue of whether a boycott's acceptable, whether it's an allowable tactic. It's an allowable tactic, nonviolent tactic for the pro-Palestinian movement. And I suppose it's fair to say that if they could legislate boycotting corporations that did business with Israel, they would do so. But that it certainly hasn't gotten that far yet, although in Europe it has, and that's part of the legislation that relates to the response that's going on at the national level. But at the state level, it's just a matter of promoting things like corporations and pension funds to divest from corporations that do business with Israel that support the occupation, that specifically support the occupation. And the response of the state legislature, provoked by the Israel lobby, has been to in turn boycott, to threaten to boycott and to criminalize the actions of corporations who choose to divest from Israel, and to command that the state pension funds divest from those corporations if those corporations choose to divest from Israel in relation to the occupation or for any reason whatsoever. So that all sounds very convoluted, but it's, I think, the headline of the editorial in the News Gazette this morning is accurate enough. One boycott issue cuts both ways, and that's fair enough as long as these both remain nonviolent tactics. But I think what it needs to be pointed out is what this law that was passed the other day in Springfield does is support at the most fundamental. What it's doing is criminalizing those who oppose violations of human rights and supporting those violations of human rights and enabling those violations of human rights. So in light of that, the controversy has to do with our two local state representatives, our state senator, Scott Bennett, appointed by the local Democrats when Mike Frericks acceded to passed along to a higher place, and Carol Ammons, who won a hard-fought battle to become our assembly person in this Champaign-Urbana district. So both of them voted in the convoluted and sort of evasive options which legislators, which I didn't even know legislators had. I would have thought there was just yes, no, and not present, or yes, no, abstain. There apparently is a sort of an excused absence alternative, or a not voting. Neither of them did that, which is signified as an E on the website, but they are signified as an NV, as a not voting. So basically there, but choosing not to vote, and probably choosing not to vote, one might say, because they got enough complaints from pro-Palestinian rights advocates in this area that they felt that at least it would be dignified of them to cast a quote, not vote, if you can wrap your head around that. So, but in my opinion, the not vote is not good enough to satisfy those of us who are supporting the BDS movement and those of us who are supporters of the nonviolent tactics that constitute the Palestinian cause, whatever differences we may have within this movement. And so to refuse, again, there's something about this issue that generates convoluted, that's constantly calling on us to sort of sort out our language and sort out our assumptions. But it isn't good enough to choose not to support violations of human rights. It's only good enough to oppose violations of human rights. And a vote of not voting isn't good enough in terms of opposing violations of human rights. I think it's an abdication of it's an evasion of the central moral issue involved in this movement. And as often is difficult in debates around the Israel-Palestine, whether it has to do with academic boycotts or boycotts in general, or the case of Stephen Saleta, academic freedom, it's always hard to get back to the substance of the issues that we're talking about here. And I think I'm going to go on David Johnson's World Labor Hour program tomorrow and talk about some of these things. And what he provoked me to do, and what I'll do on this show as well, just briefly, is read to you something that I think places the fundamental issues in context, not just in the context of Israel-Palestine, but in the context of U.S. empire and the manner in which Israel and the United States and other countries, Europe and so forth, relate to U.S. empire. And it's from a book called Cities Under Siege, The New Military Urbanism, which was published by a British geographer, Stephen Graham, in 2010. I think this kind of work is in the spirit of what David Harvey does, a very spatial analysis of how capitalism flies around the world and how violence in relation to capitalism flies around the world. And just this excerpt from this to give you a flavor of how these things are related to each other. What Graham writes in the introduction to this book is Israeli drones designed to vertically subjugate and target Palestinians are now routinely deployed by police forces in North America, Europe, and East Asia. Private operators of U.S. supermax prisons are heavily involved in running the global archipelago, organizing incarceration and torture that has burgeoned since the start of the War on Terror. Private military corporations heavily colonize reconstruction contracts in both Iraq and New Orleans. This is, of course, post-Katrina. Israeli expertise in population control is sought by those planning security operations for international events in the West, particularly the meetings of the World Bank and the WTO and so forth. And shoot-to-kill policies developed to combat suicide bombings in Tel Aviv and Haifa have been adopted by police in Europe and America, a process which directly led to the state killing of Jean-Charles de Menzies in London by London anti-terrorist police on 22 July 2005. Meanwhile, aggressive and militarized policing at public demonstrations and social mobilizations in London, Toronto, Paris, and New York are now starting to utilize the same non-lethal weapons, quote unquote, as Israel's army in Gaza or Jenin. The construction of security zones around the strategic financial cores and government districts of London and New York directly import the techniques used at overseas bases and green zones. Finally, many of the techniques used to fortify enclaves in Baghdad or permanently lock down civilians in Gaza and the West Bank are being sold around the world as cutting-edge and combat-proven security solutions, quote-unquote, by corporate coalitions linking Israeli, U.S., and other companies and states. And finally, he writes in this section, crucially, such boomerang effects that meld security and military doctrines in the cities of the West with those on colonial peripheries is backed up by the cultural geographies which underpin the political right and far right, along with hawkish commentators within Western militaries themselves. These tend to deem cities per se to be intrinsically problematic spaces, the main sites concentrating acts of subversion, resistance, mobilization, dissent, and protest, challenging national security states, both at home and abroad. And so, the reason why I was provoked to read this in terms of what David Johnson wants to talk about tomorrow, Saturday on the World Labor Hour, is to connect these things that are going on in Israel and Palestine to things that are going on in Ferguson and Baltimore and so forth. And these connections have often been made for many years in relation to the development of surveillance technology and weaponry and especially now drones, which is a particular aspect of Israeli expertise in this area. So to conclude my comments, when one says that those of us who support the Palestinian cause are singling out Israel, well, that's an absurd contention on any number of counts, but it's especially absurd given the interrelationship between what's going on in Israel and Palestine and what's going on in the rest of this neoliberal world.
Instead, you should be talking about the racist policy followed by the Latvian government or something like that.
Yeah, what they always want to get us to talk about is what China is doing in Tibet. That somehow Tibet has become the favorite issue of some people who don't know anything about it probably, but who want the people who are doing something about, who want to do something about our own government to do something about something that they possibly can't do anything about.
China doesn't have exactly the clientage relationship to the U.S. that Israel does, eh?
No, I don't think so. Not.
You're watching news from Neptune. Take on this, Ron? You want to comment on this?
Well, it's another occurrence of the old "but what about" line. Why are you talking about that? There's this other stuff going on in Tibet that's even worse. It's used constantly, the "but what abouts," and it's used on the left and right and center as well. But if you want to evade some particular charge or problem, you say, "But what about this other case over here? There's an even worse injustice being carried out over there, and why aren't you complaining about that?"
Yeah, but of course the other shoe that drops in that argument is that when you first point out that why are you singling out Israel, and then of course to make the connection between, well, you must be singling out Israel because of anti-Semitism.
Yes, that's always the kicker, right?
So it's a double whammy that you have for wanting to get mixed up with all this stuff.
Your anti-Chinese sentiments are not on display.
Yeah.
Well, I wanted to add another note to this. You were talking not only about Israel being the go-to place for finding out about crowd control, anti-personnel weapons, and the like, It turned out that, well, the Senate report on the torture operations of the CIA that came out a couple of months ago.
It didn't come out, that's the point.
Well, right. There was an very interesting documentary about it on PBS last week, and I recommend that you see it if you haven't done so. The official line that you can find in the media is in the movie Zero Dark 30, which tells the CIA
official line,
CIA side of the story. But Senator Feinstein and a few others have tried to get to the bottom of this and to get some account of what went on in the black sites in Poland and Thailand and a number of other places that are not subject to American jurisdiction or law. And it's absolutely hair-raising. The interesting additional point is that it's come out in some stories that the justification used by the CIA for carrying on this torture regime came from the deliberations of the Israeli Supreme Court in carrying on their torture operations
Absolutely.
in Palestine, Israel. So we've been hearing all this enormous complaint about we should not consult Sharia law or allow it to be implemented anywhere, but because that's foreign stuff. And yet when they want a justification line, like saving American lives by doing this, then they turn to the prior deliberations of the Israeli Supreme Court to get the line of justification.
They could have at least the Israeli Supreme Court could have at least used the Talmud to justify what they were doing, but I don't even think they did that.
Yeah. So that's a curious justification also, because they're unable to show in any actual case that the torture of these captives, Arab captives, actually led to any saving of lives or preventing any terrorist attacks.
And that's what Zero Dark 30 was supposed to do.
Yeah,
Zero Dark 30 was a direct propaganda attempt by the CIA to say, look, we would never have caught Osama bin Laden, assuming you think that was what they did was a good idea, so to speak, unless we had used enhanced interrogation techniques, i.e., unless we tortured some people into telling. It's really quite remarkable to me that the locus of propaganda in the U.S. has shifted recently, I think, from TV, radio and TV to movies. If you look at American Sniper, Zero Dark 30, and so forth, at these operations, which in many cases are aided directly and supported by the CIA, the Pentagon, and so forth, what we have here is an attempt to form a national consciousness about political matters, such as justifying the use of torture by our government, that I think would not have taken place, say, after the Vietnam War. The spate of Vietnam movies came out after the war and didn't have quite the same propaganda force that the contemporary ones do. I think it says something about the shift of media in this country that the CIA and the Pentagon find it so important to make sure that movies that cry up their operations are taking place.
But still don't underestimate the influence of 24 on television.
Yeah, well, absolutely right. But it's the extension into the feature film that seems to me to be an interesting example.
It's good because since I don't watch these films, I'm not really aware of.
Well, but a lot of people do.
I understand. I understand.
It's
kind of frightening that they do.
One of the interesting results of Seymour Hersh's recent piece in the London Review of Books, where he exposed the lies from the Obama administration about the assassination of Osama bin Laden, is that it's blew up the basis for the film Zero Dark 30. and pointed out that the film was a conscious attempt to try to justify the lies the Obama administration had made about that operation. It seems to me a good deal more should have been said and should still be said about the operation itself. But right now we're talking about the propaganda structure that forms the way most Americans think about these things.
I just want to sort of tail on on this issue of the boycott and
state
legislation. But just to add that it shows the progress. I think that 99% of the progress that the BDS and the pro-Palestinian movement have made in this country is related to just consciousness raising. I don't think any boycotts have hurt anybody or cost anybody any jobs in particular. Maybe European boycotts have had a little more impact in Israel and Palestine itself. But in any event, it goes to show you that the success is there in relation to consciousness raising because they feel like they have to react to it in the way that the state legislature has. And there's enough dissent that even people like our representatives feel like they have to do, at least not voting. I think they have to take the next step and actually oppose this. And it's interesting, I don't think the News Gazette had an actual story on this vote, but they did editorialize about it this morning. So the information you're getting through your local newspaper is completely on the editorial page. It's nothing to do with any factual coverage of what the issues were and who voted what way. They don't even talk in this editorial about the fact that Carol Ammons and Scott Bennett voted not voting. And so, but that's the next step, and it's a sign of the progress of the movement that I think that this will play out over the next few days or a couple of weeks, and who knows what's going to happen. But there are enough people now that I think that we can take this issue to these two people, and then allow them the opportunity to explain themselves, and then go from there.
I think it's important to note that what's at stake here is a legislative action that in other contexts would be recognized as monstrous. As I say, if you look at parallels to what the Illinois state legislature, and by the way, the Illinois legislature is the first one in the country to do this, although these campaigns are going on in other legislatures across the country, promoted by the same people who wanted Stephen Salit out of a job. I mean, this is Israel lobby materials, Israel lobby activities, and we've on this program frequently talked about the fantasies some people have about the Israel lobby in this country, the tail wagging the dog and things of that sort. But that's never to deny the fact that there is a serious Israel lobby in this country, just as there's a serious weapons lobby and oil lobby and a half a dozen other lobbies pressing for wars of various type, whose influence needs to be exposed and understood in order to be opposed. And that certainly is what happened here. The Illinois legislature voting overwhelmingly in favor of this bill is not an accident. It's not because the legislature said, well, we've got to get into foreign policy. It's because this was promoted to them precisely by the Israeli government and sympathizers who are indeed worried about the effectiveness of the BDS movement, as you say, David, as a matter of consciousness raising more than economic damage to Israel. But still in all, they take it seriously, and this is an indication that they take it seriously. I'd like to offer a parallel. Suppose we were talking about the matters like this a generation ago, when the question was not Israeli apartheid, and that is indeed what the question is here. The question was not Israeli apartheid, but South African apartheid. Those of us who were involved in the struggle against South African racism when South Africa, like Israel, when apartheid South Africa, like Israel, was a U.S. client, and that program was being acquiesced in by the American government because of the clientage relationship. Those of us who remember that know that there were serious attempts to boycott South African products, South African companies, and so forth in 1990 because of the horrible situation of South African apartheid. Well, the situation regarding apartheid is worse in the occupied territories in Israel than it was in Southern Africa. No one in Southern Africa, no white government in South Africa ever attacked and bombed a Bantustan, a black homeland as they were called in South Africa, and killing thousands of people as a part of their occupation. That didn't happen. Certainly there were massacres, there were a vast pall of oppression throughout South Africa against black folks, but the structures of apartheid never reached the limit to which they've reached in Israel. Okay, keep that in mind, and imagine that in 1990 a measure came before the Illinois legislature that said, look, Illinois cannot use money to invest in companies that boycott South Africa for racist reason, or in order to attack apartheid. In other words, the Illinois legislature would be supporting South African apartheid, South African racism. Now, if such a measure did appear, and it didn't, I'm certain, if such a measure did appear, people would have voted against it in a moment. You would have known right away that that can't be kept up, that there was an international campaign of boycott, divestments, and sanctions against South Africa, even though South Africa was supported by the United States. There was such a worldwide campaign, and the attempt of a state legislature to undercut that campaign, to undermine that campaign using state monies, would have been seen as outrageous. And the analogs to our present state representatives would have voted against it in a moment. There wouldn't even been any issue. Didn't arise in the first place. Now, it seems to me that, Ron was cautioning us against looking for parallels here, but it seems to me you can construct a parallel there, a parallel that is quite instructive about what's going on here and what should have been done. And I think in some ways, David, you're even being a little generous to our legislators in saying, well, at least they didn't vote for it.
Always generous to a fault.
I'm sure that's what it is. Yes, your natural sweetness is showing through.
I know I guess that's why I'm so poor.
Yeah. What's interesting to me is the way the fog machine operates on this issue. All of the campus Jewish groups across the country have been split on this issue. Mm-hmm. There are some who still follow the Anti-Defamation League and AIPAC, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, and so on. And a lot of other people who are saying, look, we want nothing to do with this. The same thing has happened, apparently, down the street on the campus of a nearby university. Yeah. There are two groups on this, and maybe an intermediate group who doesn't know what to think or to do. But yeah, it's curious the way this arose all the way across the country, this notion that any criticism of the Israeli war operations was an expression of anti-Semitism.
Oh my.
And how much confusion can be created in this way is kind of appalling.
I mean, it becomes more threadbare, but they don't have anything else to use, so they just keep using that. And David Horowitz is traveling around the country. It's become David Horowitz traveling around the country is sort of reminding me of the way Meyer Kahane of the Jewish Defense League used to travel around the country. He would just attract these hostile crowds and have to sneak out afterwards, and it's just a real spectacle. But I mean, even in the midst of that, you have to say that on this campus, and I'm sure it's typical in lots of ways, although it's quieter, and I think in many ways than many other campuses, there's the assertive support for for Israel among Jewish students and among the Jewish institutions on campus, which means mainly Hillel, is really it's abrasive in a lot of ways, but it isn't assertive in very many ways. It's just like it's very reactive to what the Students for Justice in Palestine are doing, because it's become such a weak case, and there's so fewer students actually, Jewish students actually supporting it, and B, because there's so many more Jewish students becoming members of Students for Justice in Palestine, or Jewish Voice for Peace, as is the case in both of the branches of these organizations on this campus. So things have changed. I mean, there's a big difference. The latest newsletter of the Jewish Voice for Peace points out that AIPAC has about $80 million a year to spend, and the Jewish Voice for Peace, and this is meant in a positive way, now has maybe, it's hard to read on the graph a little bit, maybe 3 million. So there's a big difference between. There's a big change between 80 million versus nothing and 80 million versus 3 million. And I think that's 3 million scares AIPAC a lot more. $3 million scares AIPAC a lot more than the $80 million scares anyone anymore, because they've heard it all before,
Yeah, what's interesting to me is how so much of this began to arise around the same time, using the same words and phrases. Anyone criticizing Israel for their war operations and mass killing was being uncivil. And,
yeah.
And
uncivil is a secular version of anti-Semitic, right?
Yeah, right. And
but
there's it seems to me someone is trying to mount a nationwide purge of faculty members who are critical of Israel.
That's absolutely true.
And that someone lives on Lynn Street in Champaign, and his name is Kerry Nelson.
We have a local representative of the movement. Exactly. It's too true. Kerry is a personal friend, or a personal acquaintance at least, of several of us, but he has been quite remarkably, amazingly, active in the movement to deny Stephen Salaita his job because of the things he said and thought, and similar activities across the country in the academic positions that he's held. Naturally, we'd be happy to have Kerry come in and talk to us about this sometime, but I don't think he'll do it.
Yeah. Is this just paranoia, or did we see the same words and phrases and complaints arising at about the same time in so many campuses all across the country?
Oh, it's
with the ultimate
intention,
apparently, although I hate to attribute
motives. Yes, we know it.
Right.
No less conspiratorial.
Right, purging the faculty of critics of Israel.
This is certainly true, and we have to put that in the context of American politics in general. This isn't new. I mean, the egregious violations of academic freedom, which we've seen in the little university down the street and across the country, have a long history in the American Academy, going back to the First World War, when there were vicious attempts to remove people who had a critical attitude towards the Wilson administration's arrangement of the U.S. involvement in the European War. Through those of us who are old enough to remember it and were in academia at the time, know perfectly well what happened during Vietnam. And the careful campaigns and very effective campaigns of removing critics from positions in the American Academy where they might be critical of the American war in Vietnam. It has continued up to today, and these are campaigns that have a local habitation and a name. You can point to the people who are doing it and the reasons that it's being done. And the context that I think we have to remember is that this is not a coterie movement. This is not sort of a little group of people who are trying to get their own peculiar views of a president in the American Academy. This is a movement that is part of American foreign policy and the instruction in history and politics and related issues that occurs on American campuses. It's an effort to shape the mind of a generation just as an effort to shape the mind of a generation in the 60s or in the teens were related to American foreign policy. The U.S. support for Israel is not based on a conspiratorial or manipulative origin amongst the supporters of Israel. It has to do with American policy. America has used Israel as a cornerstone of its policy to control the Middle East, and in order to do that, it's acquiesced in apartheid policies, racist policies, which it officially disapproves of. You can find official disapproval throughout the Obama administration and earlier administrations of the policies that are being implemented by Israel against the Palestinians. They're officially disapproved of, but the government looks the other way because Israel is too valuable as a stationary aircraft carrier in the Middle East. And that's the context, it seems to me, in which we have to see what's going on in the American campuses. And I must admit, even in my dotage, I'm astonished at the strength of that campaign. I would not have suggested that something like this could have happened in the Illinois state legislature, as indeed it didn't happen in regard to South Africa a generation ago. I'm amazed.
Yeah. Well, it's not the first time that things like this have happened.
Exactly.
Even concerning, well, the University of Illinois, I'm not sure how much resistance there was to World War I, but in the 30s, I understand, and I'm not sure I have this history entirely right. There was an attempt to purge the Keynesians from the economics department.
Oh, yes.
And that went on in a number of places.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I guess I want to point out, maybe for a future discussion, there's also interesting context in which this plays out, in the context of identity politics and civility on campus, and the manner in which Phyllis Wise has promoted what she calls inclusiveness on this campus through a campaign called Inclusive Illinois, which has its own website and sponsored a bunch of lectures. And it's interesting how convoluted and ideologically strange this sort of thing becomes. There was a report that came out a couple of weeks ago about a topic called microaggressions at the University of Illinois, based on a survey which shows, as skeptical as I am of some aspects of identity politics, it shows that most minority students feel uncomfortable on this campus. They feel disrespected on this campus. They feel treated insensitively on this campus. And that kind of goes against the grain. I think that Phyllis Wise maybe got a little more than she was prepared for in starting this campaign, after she herself was treated in an uncivil way for making students go to class in cold weather at the beginning of last year. And this all came out of that. But now it's really showing that a lot of people, not just Phyllis Wise, feel that people say rude things to them, make remarks about them, or that they feel uncomfortable in classrooms or singled out. And I think this is to be taken seriously. And curiously, I think it'll be interesting to see how Phyllis Wise handles this issue, along with all these other issues, as they move forward, as this notion of civility kind of jumps around into various contexts and plays out in ways that don't always allow people to control the meaning of that word and how it. Because I think that it really is a serious problem, and I think that's why, on the one hand, Jim Dye wrote a column just completely disrespecting the study that had to do with these students' experiences on campus, but also why there hasn't been any response whatsoever from Phyllis Wise into this rather serious study about how people feel. And then you add on to that I think that things are coming apart at the seams a little bit here in this idyllic time of year. Football players are complaining. Women's basketball players are complaining. There's a whole lot of stuff going on that's out of control, and that if there's anything that university administrators want, it's to be in control of everything on their terms, and they just can't seem to do it.
What about trigger warnings?
Well, I mean, that's...
Yeah, I think some of the stuff has been grossly overdone. But
it has been, and I'm skeptical of some of it, but, and you could read the study, it's online, and you could read Jim Day's column about it, and you could read the comments subject to that column if you go on the on the web, but I think it's to be taken seriously in the sense that in the sense that the claim that students are being treated fairly and equally on this campus is overblown, and I think that's a serious issue.
Yeah.
I think you and I might have some disagreements on this, David, down the road if we were to examine it, because it seems to me that at least part of what we're seeing here, and the reason I even sympathize with Jim Dye's point on the column the other day, to some extent. Now, I say that carefully because Dye is someone we've known for a while, and he has written absolutely outrageous things about political figures on campus, including Stephen Salaita, stuff that is certainly highly objectionable. But one of the things I think we're dealing with here, the larger context in a sense of what we're dealing with here, is what's become of American liberalism in our lifetime. I mean, I think a devil's bargain was made by American liberalism about 40 years ago with the beginnings of the assault of neoliberalism. American liberalism, which I take to be the tradition that was perhaps best represented by the Roosevelt's New Deal down through Lyndon Johnson's Great Society, a tradition of moderated capitalism, we might say, a tradition of social democracy, although we don't like to use that word in the U.S. Social, I mean. The notion here was that American democracy needed to be, American capitalism needed to be reined in and needed to be made user-friendly for the majority of the population. You needed things like Social Security and medical supports and things like that, education such as the GI Bill produced and so forth, that were not simply marketplace items, i.e. you could have as much education as you could afford, but you had to come with money on the table. No, there had to be supports for that. People who did not have the money should be able to go to college, and that was true for that generation, particularly for that generation after the Second World War, the same generation that threw out Winston Churchill and established social ameliorations in Britain, did the same thing in the U.S., a slightly different form because of the different experience of the two communities beforehand. But what we had here was a tradition of American liberalism that said, yes, we can't just have a brutal, laissez-faire, free market system. We have to have a system in which there are social supports for education, health, housing, things like that, for Americans across the country. Well, that changed. That changed after the 60s. That changed in the 1970s, and American liberalism was confronted with a resurgent business class that said, look, we're going to get rid of this stuff. We're going to get rid of these supports, or we're certainly going to minimize them. We've got to liberalize the economy, and here's where the language breaks down. Liberalize it in this sense meant getting rid of things that were social supports for the majority. In Europe, it was called austerity, and it was more clearly understood. But in this country, we didn't use the language quite so clearly, and people didn't realize what was happening for a long time. It's only now in retrospect that we can see how these changes took place in the 70s. But American liberals understood it. They're not absolutely stupid. American liberals understood what was going on. They saw that the move to ameliorate the harsh edges of American capitalism, which the New Deal was the best example of, that was being brought to an end. That the sort of class politics that had its origin in the New Deal was being destroyed. What were you going to do instead then? How were you going to help people in this society? Well, the answer was identity politics. The answer was every particular group, not just people who are on the bottom of the economic ladder, but every particular group should step forward with its own claims on the society. So black people, women, Asians, sexual minorities, all of these folks should have their own, as it were, affirmative action programs so their particular problems could be faced. And American liberals in proposing these problems said, there, look at that. Of course, we're not helping people at the bottom of the economic ladder anymore, but we are trying to help particular groups who need help. Well, one of the things that did, of course, was produce a great deal of resentment in groups that were not being helped, or groups that or groups who thought that other groups were being helped more. So there was real problems with this, and that's what 40 years of neoliberalism has brought us. Now, it seems to me that a lot of the things that we're talking about on campus right now grow out of that liberal mentality, and that we need to examine carefully what's going on there and the sort of politics that really will deal with the problems that are being put forward, not these, not speech codes, trigger warnings, oppositions to microaggressions and so on. That's not where the problem's coming from. That's the sort of sad fallback position of American liberalism. Look, we won't try to change anything the society does, but be really hard on the things society says. They can't say anything nasty to you because, after all, we're not giving you any money to go to college.
Yeah, well, to me, this is part of a larger theme of trying to subjectivize everything, of making it a matter of your feelings. Even marketing has gone in this direction. People are being urged now to sell experiences. So, have you bought any experiences recently?
I knew guys at Berkeley in the '60s who wanted to sell me experiences.
Well, let me say this. I think it's a complicated issue, and I understand what you're saying, and I have my own skepticisms. But it's interesting. First of all, when Jim Dye criticizes the microaggression report, he's criticizing any form of criticism on campus, anybody complaining about anything at any level. And of course, ultimately, it's the Students for Justice in Palestine. It's the students who want to divest from coal. They're all lumped in together in the mind of Jim Dye, and I understand that. I mean, I could sort that out for myself, but still, I think it's the fact that these things emerge is symptomatic. It's symptomatic of identity politics, and it's symptomatic of the failure of the larger structural failures of equality in this society, that it could only be expressed in this form, but it still is being expressed in this form. And Phyllis Wise, with all her efforts, can't control how it's being expressed, and it has to be brought into a larger context.
Yeah. It's interesting to me the way this has evolved, the social conflicts involved. In early American history, it was, well, some will dispute this, of course, or anything I say, but conflict of sections, which came to a head in the Civil War. And with the closing of the frontier in the 1890s and so on, it became more and more a matter of class conflict. But our way of avoiding that is to well, Arthur Bentley's book on the political process, 1908, began to talk about the real political process was between groups, pressure groups, and this is how the new kind of liberalism.
Anything to avoid class politics.
Yes,
anything to avoid class politics.
Or you could read it as, in what I think it was in some ways, a transposition of class politics into acceptable language. Where you say, we're talking about groups around here. Don't talk to me about proletariats. Don't talk to me about ruling classes or capitalists. But we're still talking about the relationship between groups. And by God, when we begin to look at them, they begin to look like proletarians, ruling classes, and capitalists.
But then that talk about groups then degenerated into later versions of liberalism with into identity politics.
That's that you said in one sentence what I spent about 10 minutes trying to say there, Ron. The degeneration of American liberalism, which is finally a class politics, the degeneration of American liberalism, which is a class politics coming out of the New Deal, into identity politics is the major story here. And we have to understand is that's a defeat, that's a fallback position for American liberalism, one it's sort of stuck with, right? We're not going to do our job, say American liberals, but hey, we're going to do something nice. We're going to help people who need it.
But Chomsky always refers to the civilizing of the culture in a very positive sense, and so we have to acknowledge that whatever the non-class nature of these gains, and whatever the the sort of diversionary nature of some gains that don't address fundamental issues of class inequality. There's a civilizing aspect there and a consciousness-raising aspect there. I think we have to figure out how we can build on that. I mean, we have to challenge it in a certain way, but also build on it in a certain way.
Well, but it wouldn't work as a diversion if it weren't a good thing. If it weren't, if it weren't something worthwhile. Discrimination in all these forms is not a good thing. But once you've given up class politics, you've got to look around for something else good you could do instead. And what what American liberals decided was what they could do instead was deal with forms of real discrimination. So the position of women in the society, as illustrated by the recent ending of the Mad Men series, changed remarkably from the period they're looking at, which is the 1970s, to today.
Yeah.
That's important.
Yeah, my concern is that it's been trivialized and turned into a matter of personal feelings.
Exactly.
And so on. And there's a whole lot of self-pity around, and people even starting lawsuits on the basis of pain and suffering. Paul Krugman has mentioned this thing that people seem to be coming up with, in effect. Ma, he looked at me funny.
Yeah, but I mean, it's important. It's important to take people's feelings seriously.
Yes.
I mean, again, I have my doubts about this, but young people, are, need to feel as if they're taken seriously, and this is the manner in which, this is the culture in which they can express dissatisfactions. I think the dissatisfactions are ultimately much more profound than that.
But when American liberalism goes from saying we want to change what people do in their work lives, we want to provide real supports for their real life, to we want to change what people say so that no one is nasty to black folks, women, any other oppressed groups. And the solution to their oppression will not be any objective change in their life conditions, but will stop people from being mean to them and saying mean things. And Ron pointed out before he went on the air, just to ruin my day, David Brooks' column in the New York Times today, where he speaks about how we teach people, not to do mean things and say mean things. I mean,
so David Brooks is on the cultural sensitivity bandwagon now.
Spiritual education. He's into it.
Okay, good.
Yeah, should we be suppressing hate speech?
I guess that's exactly, and that's the strongest example in some
maybe
sense.
Jim Dye should start reading David Brooks's columns.
I'm afraid
He's
does.
about the most insensitive man on the face of the earth.
Right. You've been watching News from Neptune for the 21st week of 2015, a Mythology of War edition. And indeed, that's what we have been talking about, believe it or not. I'm Carl Estabrook. My discussants tonight have been David Green and Ron Szoke. Our thanks to our director and producer, Jason Liggett. Upcoming programs here on UPTV include Labor's Worldview, Sunday at 4 p.m. with our colleague David Johnson. And we should note you're going to be on David's radio program tomorrow.
Tomorrow, 11 a.m., World Labor Hour on WEFT,
right.
Our favorite radio station.
That's right. You will also hear more news from outside the bubble, as Harry Shearer says, that you don't hear elsewhere in CU. So see our Facebook page for News from Neptune and the blog, newsfromneptune.com, which is back up, I'm happy to say. Inshallah, we'll be back next week with a new edition of News from Neptune to remind you, in the words of Edward de Vere, Edward de Vere is the Earl of Oxford, and thereby hangs a tale, but we haven't time for it now. To remind you, in the words of Edward de Vere, what's past is prologue, what to come in yours and my discharge. In the meantime, confusion to our enemies, and a good night to you.